Back to sacrifice. Protocol.
Dalton, I don't know if you know this, but he has a PhD from Yale in both American Studies and African American Studies. And he works largely with aesthetics and politics, I would say, and covers art forms from music, visual art, literature, really a very interdisciplinary approach. The talk today is about the beginning chapters of his book on Louis Armstrong, which he's completing now. It's going to be a great book. So, without further ado, Dalton Anthony Jones is going to dazzle us with archives from New Orleans and sound ordinances, which are really hilarious. So, welcome.
Thank you. First, so I should say definitely thank you for the Institute for this. It's an opportunity I have not had in I don't know how long since starting grad school, I guess, to actually have a semester to work on my ideas, to work on my ideas in a climate of calm patience and care and focus has been immeasurably important. And so I just thank the amazing work that you're doing there. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you for the Institute. I would also like to thank the Department of Ethnic Studies and the School of Cultural and Critical Studies for allowing me a semester leave, and for all the people like Thomas who probably have been taking up the slack since I've been gone. Incredibly supportive through my time here and nurturing my work, sometimes firmly, which I need personally, but always with my best interests at stake. I also always like to begin by giving thanks and a measure of gratitude to the indigenous people, the First Nations, on whose land we are gathered on, not their land, but who were the caretakers of this land and did a fine job until colonial settler culture kind of came over it. I would also like to give honor and gratitude to the hundreds of thousands and millions of Africans who crossed the Atlantic for decades and centuries to provide us with the bounty that we enjoy in the form of our social surplus. Hopefully anything that I say can live up to those traditions. Well, the last thing I wanted to really do was to sit here and kind of bore you with reading an essay, right, of something that I had already written or that I was kind of, you know, scattered in the process of writing. In my mind, essays are best read in the comfort of a living room or one's study, or if you're a student, the library. What is that? So you know, that said, you know, one assumes a certain degree of risk if one does not prepare point by point their presentation and read from it. So I will, you know, one runs the risk of either threatening the audience's security. On the other hand, one runs the risk of threatening one's own, which is mine. So I'm going to try to cut it down the middle. I will read a part of some stuff, and what I'm going to be reading is not necessarily pertaining directly to this beginning section in New Orleans, the engineering of the post-slave subject, but what I hope it will do will help frame my project and some of the personal, theoretical, intellectual concerns that I bring, how I got to the project. So in the second half, I'm going to try to open it up a little bit, and hopefully we'll have, so what way I want to, what you can expect from the talk, kind of a project overview, which I'll read, some discussion a little bit about the theoretical concerns that drive my project, and I'll place those within the context of turn of the century New Orleans and some of the tensions there, and then a third section which will go into some of the archival material a little closely. How does that sound? Does that sound like it might work? So I'm going to start by reading a passage really from like the introduction of my project. Let me start at something like the beginning. My path to Armstrong's emotional production took a circuitous route. I imagine like so many others, I must have already been developing a vague relationship with his work by the time I was 6 or 7 years old. But the moment of contact is impossible to fix with precision. Armstrong seems to have always already been there, a phantom presence, firmly embedded in the architecture of my own and the collective conscience, something akin to the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus. My assimilation into consumer culture was so rapid and immediate that it predates memory, predates my ability even to distinguish the signs and decipher the codes that are by now interwoven so intimately into the very fabric of my individual and social identity. Armstrong's voice and image must have filtered through to me from any number of sources: television, radio, phonographs, and tape cassettes. Overheard snippets of conversation, comedic parodies, storefront displays, and assorted commercial propaganda. I want to remember a black and white image of him walking across a stage. It is on a television screen. I have the scenario vividly constructed in my mind. Armstrong is in front of a studio audience and approaching a talk show host. Johnny Carson, or perhaps Merv Griffin. But this vignette is most likely the product of a sentimental desire, an overactive imagination, a longing on my part for something concrete, for some genuine contact with a man who is, in point of fact, very far removed from my life. I remember my grandmother playing Lou Rawls and the sounds of Nat King Cole and Ella Fitzgerald at Christmas. At home, Motown, soul, and funk, and disco were in the air, along with the sounds of Odetta, Baez, and Dylan. My father had a nice collection of blues records: Mississippi John Hurt, Lightning Hopkins, Robert Johnson, among others. There was the jazz that came down from two of my uncles, I should say, one of my uncles and one of my aunts. A longer discussion about sexual identity. Both percussionists, but it was mostly hard stuff. Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers, Max Roach, Dizzy, and Bird, sprinkled with Mongo Santa Maria and Tito Puente. Another uncle, a guitar player, introduced me to the work of Hendrix, Santana, Jimmy Page, and Johnny Winter. Armstrong was spoken of with respect, but never dwelled upon for long. By the age of 11 or 12, when I began to exercise more direct power as a consumer, I must have somehow known the tunes and a handful of lyrics to Hello Dolly, Mac the Knife, and Cabaret, but Armstrong was for the most part incapable of holding my serious attention. I definitely never purchased his work. By the age of 16, I thought I was blazing a new and independent musical trail, and Armstrong all but disappeared from my consciousness. If I were asked, I'm sure that I would have associated his music and posture with easy-to-swallow pop songs and a ready, willing compliance with the demands of the white establishment. I wasn't mad at him, at least not any more than I would be upset with Mr. Hall, our family friend who had grown up in Georgia during the 30s and 40s and who worked as a manual laborer for white people his whole life, cutting their grass, fixing their leaky faucets. His large hands were gnarled, his back was arched, and he spoke with a graveled country accent. I remember him ordering me once, as he reclined in our dining room, to come over here, boy, and fetch me some water. He just seemed like a quaint relic from another time, someone too old-fashioned to know any better. Without question, I went into the kitchen and poured him a glass of water. He had earned it. Although I didn't know it at the time, the questions that inform Black Market and my study, Why Is This Man Smiling?, were already beginning to take form. I can trace their conscious evolution to an unlikely source, hip-hop. Like so many others, I was swept away by the passion and energy of the new music when it rose up from the fringes of urban society in the 1980s. I was a high school dropout, an alienated teenager seeped in the predominantly white, anti-establishment world of punk rock. Hip-hop expressed a countercultural attitude and a sense of community that spoke forcefully to me, and it was an easy transition. The music combined a defiant yet joyful edge with a seemingly democratic, collective, revolutionary, even anarchical message that I passionately craved. It had a structure that appeared to resist easy commoditization, and rhythms that, while based around a simple meter, weaved in and out of one another in unexpected, creative, often unnerving ways. It was rebel music that stole beats and hooks from any and all sources. Nothing was sacred. The only ingredients necessary to participate were a turntable, microphone, vocabulary, wit, confidence, and hormones. I reveled in the fact that its style was an affront to the aesthetics of the recording industry and the vertical hierarchy of commercial sound. The techniques of scratching defamed the very status of vinyl. Looped, grating, repetitious, and unapologetically black. Its sounds twisted over a bass-heavy beat, accompanied by the direct articulation of raw human emotions that felt subversive in their sexual, racial, and political honesty. The music seemed to fly in the face of the expectations and requirements of the dominant market. That some 80 years ago, these were more or less the very qualities that had defined the relationship between the newly emergent music of jazz and the mainstream escaped my notice. The rapid flights of Bird, maybe, the dissonance of Ornette Coleman, perhaps, but hip-hop felt millions of miles away from the pleasant, rich-toned, sonorous, commercially accessible arrangements of Louis Armstrong that I occasionally heard playing on diner jukeboxes and in waiting rooms as I read back issues of People magazine. This illusion was quickly dispelled. As if by magic, I watched the status of hip-hop transform. While it may have had a brief moment as an oppositional force, anything even remotely dissident about its original posture has been rapidly and thoroughly tranquilized. Poem. Lesson. Nationalism makes you crazy, you said, pointing out Sister Aminata talking to herself in her elaborate headdress, her colorful buba and skirt. I remember she had few teeth and spat her words out like machine guns, spraying bullets at everyone and at no one in particular inside her borders. Noticing you, she would let loose a barrage of language unrecognizable as anything but her own. The few garbled syllables she had at her command repeated after a pause, during which she would glare at you as if reloading her clip. It was her own cosmos with her own gods. That is by the poet John Ferris, New York City, 2003. John Ferris's poem elegantly captures the deterioration, the deterritorialization, if you will, of the traditional strategies of survival that once sustained and fueled black culture, even as it has struggled against exploitation and racial terror. Sister Aminata's inarticulate mumbles, her solipsism, her anachronistic reach for an African in past, the disillusionment of political ideologies invoked in the opening line, the impotence of cherished spiritual traditions invoked in the last, and the crushing burdens of a matriarchy existing under the sustained assault of a dominant patriarchal society, all point to a decisive fracture in the oral and cultural continuity of the black experience. The poem captures the desperation lurking behind modern life. If at one time human voices and musical culture were able to provide the hope of a meaningful avenue for adapting to the travails of oppression, Sister Aminata's overflowing emotional baggage, her failed efforts to even identify a suitable language by which to express or target upon which to enact her still unresolved pain, anger, and frustration adequately sums up the neurosis infecting contemporary subjectivity and Black cultural production. Although it may be too much to ask, I am convinced that I'm not the only one tacitly seeking resolution to such crises in their engagement with the Armstrong commodity. According to many cultural critics, Armstrong's ability to resolve and overcome the fractures of modernity is precisely his most stirring value. I would go so far as to argue that the search for meaning behind the dis-ease of modern life is precisely why so many people are drawn to the resonant sound of his voice like moths to a light bulb. Our own struggles appear to coincide with Armstrong's as we harmonize our rhythms to the structure of his music. At times, we experience a sense of identification bordering on kinship when we latch our emotions, feelings, and desires to what we imagine to be his. Underlying this synchronism, I believe, is a general sense that Armstrong was able to rise above the material and spiritual obstacles life put in his way. That he was able to forge a viable road to happiness by disalienating himself from the self-same oppressive system we are so intimately enmeshed with today. And yet, there is an almost desperate longing, a sense of emptiness lurking beneath the surface of the popular fixation with his life and music. The retroactive post-mortem investment in Armstrong's legacy, the stated effort to preserve, quote, preserve a better understanding of Black culture needs to be examined critically. In addition to honoring the undeniable joy and catharsis he brought to literally millions of people, when we begin to peer beneath the surface, we find an anxiety of loss, a sense of mourning at work in the act of Armstrong's preservation. To some extent, his memory is offered as a panacea to the crisis of Sister Aminata. But if the Armstrong commodity's value can be said to represent a long trail of collective emotional and financial investments, then it is, in fact, for ourselves that we mourn. The shroud of mediation that confronts us when we access this commodity means that the intimacy we experience while engaging it, if not completely elusive, is certainly abstract and, what is more troubling, vulnerable to any number of self-defeating contradictions that ensure that our own status is more closely resembling Sister Aminata's than any idealized self-identification we might have with Louis Armstrong. While many nuances and mediations are at stake which need to be accounted for, visual antiphonies, excuse me. While many nuances and meditations are at stake which need to be accounted for, visual antiphonies, collaborative engagements, the power of physical gesture, technological interventions, etc., it is safe to say that sound is the dominant substance animating the Armstrong commodity. More than anything else, it was Armstrong's ability to channel sound and strategically harness the power of his voice that gives the product bearing his name and the resonance of his image its distinct value on the market. The gift of articulation was his most creative and authoritative contribution to the production process. It is, first and foremost, because of this talent that the commodity continues to resonate so long after the direct investment of his emotional and physical labor was complete. If technologies of articulation played a vital role and extended the resonant life of his voice, we can also say that this voice, in turn, has added and continues to add, even after his death, immeasurable value to all of the technologies and commodities and institutions associated with its social life. When someone purchases a sound system for their car or home, after all, they do so in the hopes of listening to sound, most likely in the form of music. In this regard, Armstrong's contribution, like those of other voices with the power to resonate in similar though distinct ways, is absolutely central to the maintenance of a far broader and highly intricate economic system. The sound commodity is unique in that we are able to measure in a demonstrative way the extent to which human resonance, and there's another discourse to be added on the status of the human. So I have it in italics, and I deal with that issue in other places. But here I use the term unproblematically in that regard. Unproblematically in relation to what invoking the term human produces. Right now I'm just reading it in the context. The sound commodity is unique in that we are able to measure in a demonstrative way the extent to which human resonance is the glue that both facilitates and legitimizes the operation of the political economy. It is at least a partial source of agent of value within the commodity and the commoditization process. We confront the beauty and danger of voice. In particular, the warmth and intimacy supplied by the articulated human voice. I'm trying to condense here. This power lies in its distinctive ability to penetrate and manipulate the world of emotion and desire while appearing to flow from a kindred source of intimate subjectivity instead of from a dislocated object of commercial exchange or a product of statecraft, which is where I'm going, this idea of statecraft. This sly fragmentation is so pronounced that it becomes easy to bypass the central political question of just how deeply the product is actually embedded within, which is to say, implicated in a larger process of commoditization and political subordination that remains essentially impersonal, if not, in certain circumstances, totalitarian. The seductive yet dictatorial function of authority and the transformation of sound into a commodity and agent of official discourse was set into motion long before Armstrong was born. And as the ongoing contest over sound and space in New Orleans demonstrates, continually threatens to subordinate the production, reproduction, and dissemination of voice. This state of affairs reflects the expansion and sophistication of a process of enclosure that necessitates a better understanding of how we conceive the quality and substance of value in general. So that's the reading portion of what I hope to do. Okay? As you can see already. So, I'm trying to lay out, in the project overview, the implication, right? The commoditization and assimilation of culture, and the commoditization, culture broad, social phenomena, and the commoditization and assimilation of voice, more personal, let us say, although, a social, always social at the same time, but voice, to think about an individual voice brings us down to the corporeal, if you want to say that. And if we're going to think about voice, we're going to think about, too, the fact that emotion, we'll go here in a second, is at the core of the production of voice, or the process, let us say, of articulation. I say that to say that we're having an emotional problem here, right? We are emotionally disturbed. We have an emotional, dare I say, psychosis working here in our everyday forms of articulation. And this becomes very important to my thesis, something I'll try to talk about. But I want us to understand that I'm really arguing, right, that on the one hand, the presence of Armstrong is ubiquitous, but I'm also arguing there is no Armstrong. right? So I'm not writing a biography of Armstrong per se. I'm writing really a biography or a story. I have no interest in writing the biography of a jazz musician. First of all, there are tomes written already on Armstrong. If you want to know the details of his biographical life, there are places to go. He's got one of the biggest wiki pages on on Wikipedia. I'm really trying to tell a story of what I call the Armstrong hyphen commodity. So anytime I'm invoking Armstrong, I'm really invoking the Armstrong commodity, plain and simple. If there is no relationship here with Armstrong. But that said, so it's another way to say what I'm really talking about in talking about Armstrong are a more immediate set of social relations. To talk about Armstrong is to talk about a commoditization problem, a process of statecraft, and the status of our social relations more broadly. Armstrong has really disappeared from the picture. So there are a couple of things that make his particular life. Sorry?
You have plenty of time.
Okay, good. Yeah.
2 hours.
There's a lot to
Yeah.
so one of the challenges of doing a project overview. Once you start, where do you stop with some of these ideas like the human, right? But, there's some phenomenal things about that life that was Armstrong's. First of all is his lifespan. Born in 1901, died in 1971. I mean, I wanted to write about hip-hop, and I went to grad school, they're like, that's too recent, I mean, ironically, it's all changed now. It's like a really cool thing to do, but when I went into grad school, they told me, you just didn't write about something, or you have to historicize your project before you can just sit there and write about hip-hop. I was like, oh, so you're lucky, Dan. you get to dive right in. So, there's something to be said for that life. 1971 to so his life spans all the most important and crucial transitions and junctures of 20th century modernity, which is still arguably our modernity. I mean, we can say postmodern, what have you, but it was definitive. His role in popular culture. It's not just that he lived those many years. He had like a 50 plus year career where he was on the front lines of popular culture, social relations at every, technological innovation, political innovations, globalization processes, economic processes, changes in the posture that were happening. Armstrong was there for like 50 years. It's like, this is great. There's an organization of my project right there, right? His popularity and universal appeal is another thing. It's not just that he was there. It's not just that he was recording. It's that he remained popular for 50. There was a brief period in the 50s where he kind of fell out of favor, during the 60s, but he quickly gained respect. It was like a year and a half after that, even guys like Miles and cats who would disrespect him were like, well, come to think of it, this is where I learned to play, so listening to Armstrong's records. I mean, there's only so far you can go in not acknowledging the influence. And then we could get into all of the aesthetic contributions, improv, the structure of popular songs, music, rhythm, almost every element of sound. So there were enticing reasons. But the question that I'm wanting to ask, right, is what kind of commodity is this? What are we looking at when we look at the Armstrong commodity? And now, finally, we can try to segue, I guess, and I'm going to try to be, and this is a challenge to the whole project, talking about the past while making sure that we're also talking about the present. Because to me, I have very little interest in just dead history per se. I mean, there are a lot of historian buffs, and it's great, but if it doesn't relate to something we're going through now, then I'm not really clear what whiz we're talking about. So let me try to offer something by a segue. And I can see, oh, I love this thing. Now do that. Whew. Oh, is this going to work? I should have... Probably should have tested it. I think it'll work. Oh, sound might not. No, the sound's on. We should get the sound plugged in. I think that's important. Is it here? Oh, yeah, it's up. What are you looking for? Oh, oh. This is why you don't show up late, man.
It could happen anyway.
Yes,
You know,
it's a-
technology being what it is.
Well, let me read this while we try to do it. In a report from the January 21st, 2014 New Orleans Advocate, trombone player Glenn David Andrews led a band of musicians and members of New Orleans music community as they paraded into the city council chamber, where they performed a quick jazz funeral for a withdrawn sound ordinance they feared would have irreparably damaged their ability to play music in New Orleans. Neighborhood advocates have complained that existing noise regulations are particularly unworkable in the quarter, as the rules outlaw sound that is 10 decibels above the ambient or surrounding level, a standard that has proved difficult to enforce in entertainment zones like Bourbon Street. Palmer and Head pledged they will have a drawn-out process, beginning with a draft to be presented at a January 27th committee meeting, and renewed focus on improving the enforcement of the city's existing noise regulations, a task that is supposed to move from the police department to the health department. Right on cue if it works. This recent news item struck me as extraordinary for a number of reasons. And these are notes, so I don't know if I'm tempted to read them anyway. First of all, it's the very precision of the measurement being deployed, right? Something as ephemeral as noise, something so unbound and so fleeting, has been subjected to really a microscopic level of scrutiny, rationality, and scientific management. It is impressive. It is as impressive as it is easy to overlook the fact that by 2014 we are at a point where the city council is still passing ordinances about sound, but has gone to a point where we don't even necessarily question their ability to measure, not just down to the very decibel, the production of sound, right? But the production of ambient sound. And at the center of this political showdown, therefore, we see the hand of a bureaucratic apparatus, a state structure with a long history So they've long organized the substance, volume, and discursive parameters of sound. Not only surveyed, calibrated, and cataloged the ambiance of shared space, it's created an acoustic norm with a standard sonic deviation. So they've told us, basically, or they've imposed upon a given geography, apparently they're going to claim that this norm that they've developed is scientific, that it's rational, based on a means that they deem, through democratic process, but still statecraft nonetheless, to be normal, ambient sound measurement that one can and cannot deviate from. 10 decibels to be precise. On the other hand, we have this fact that the protesters are using music. Their deployment of organized noise demonstrates that they too have a sophisticated understanding of their own sonic power, of the amplitude, resonance, not only of their ability to create, but also to resist and impact. So there's incredible sonic politics being played out that is not limited to this 2004 moment, but it has a continuity to it, and a political continuity, a cultural continuity. Not equal partners in the dialectic of power, they are no mere dupes, we would think, in the game of sonic negotiation. Another quote from a related article to this event. The proposed ordinance also would have changed how enforcers measure sound. And this is interesting. And this change to how the enforcement of sound through measurement came out of a negotiation between the political members in the Chamber of Congress and this mob. What do you call that? A mob. That's not the same kind of organized political unit that's producing sound that we would think that we would find sitting in an assembly chamber of the city council, right? The proposed ordinance also would have changed how enforcers measure sound. One of the most contested aspects was a requirement that called for measuring sound level at the property line of the club, property relations, at the property line of the club, not at the home of a person complaining about the noise. In other words, the spatial relationship of noise and its inherent quality as a substance, if you will. Noise. Where is the value there? One of my arguments that I borrow from Lyndon Barrett, and is in turn borrowed a brilliant philosopher of blackness and value. In fact, his groundbreaking book is called Blackness and Value. He died, murdered tragically in 2008, just an incredible loss to black thought. But nevertheless, he left us a lot to chew on. He deploys this concept that I've kind of borrowed and expanded upon. He uses it in once or points, but he talks about the point of production, right? The point of articulation, which is borrowed in turn from Marxian theories of like the point of exploitation of labor. Traditionally, where is labor exploited on the factory floor? Well, we're going to apply that to the point of articulation in terms of the act of voice production and reception, that dialectic that's taking place, or that relationship that's taking place. Is it at the point of production, the bar, or the point of reception at the ear in the domestic space? Is it the private capitalist space, or is it the domestic space? Is it the artist, or is it the oh goodness, I gotta move on. How does one impose a scale of sonic normativity or deviance? Their slogan, "Music ain't a crime," chanted, sang by the protesters, draws us to the inside and the outside of the law. Outlaw sound, the attempt to establish sonic norms, is a technical, a cultural, an economic, a spatial, an emotional, a juridical, and a political issue. And it's all of the above. The jurisdiction between the police and health departments is also interesting. So theoretically, I want to take us to, and I'm going to have to go through this faster than I would like. Four governing axioms to my project in terms of how I'm thinking about, what is the commodity is the question, right? What is the commodity we're dealing with? What is my relationship to the commodity, and what is the commodity's relationship to the social realm, the social world? So there's a few different ways to think about it. The commodity is the core. What kind of commodity is it? And I have four kind of governing frames that I deal with. Axiom 1. Noise is to sound as affect is to emotion. Right? Noise studies and sound studies are two very different disciplines, not two very different, but are distinct disciplines. Once we get to sound, sound is really the social organization of noise. Noise is what happens. Noise can happen in all kinds of contexts. The argument being, though, when sound happens, that's what we attribute value to noise. That's when it becomes sound, right? So there's a movement from that to you're saying like, whoa, or you saying like, why is he clapping? Or saying like, wake up everybody, what have you. That's a cultural, social value that we create upon what happened. Noise is to sound, is affect, is to emotion. A lot of debate about it. What is affect? What is emotion? What are the lines? Essentially, without going all into it, we can think about affect theory asserts that, going back to Spinoza, these are bigger discussions. It's really a biological, somatic. It's a biological affect is. There's a nerve impulse that goes in. When it becomes pain, when you say that is pain, that hurts, and I can tell someone like, I hurt my foot. That's separate from the impulse that drove down and created whatever sensation is happening in me. So affect theory has become very important because we're starting to increasingly recognize the power of biopolitics as a form of management of human beings. Let me stop, right? Sentient beings, let me say. Sentience being that ability to experience an affect, or consciousness or something. By the time it gets to emotion, we're into your feelings or sentiment, right? So there's a relationship I'm seeing here. So when I'm analyzing noise and sound, I'm also drawing an analogy or saying that there is a relationship between affect and emotion. Axiom 2. Sound is one of the primary mechanisms by and through which we constitute our subjectivity. Noise/sound. Sound is one of the primary mechanisms by through which constitute ourselves as social beings. It's a personal and it's a social medium, if you want to call it that. Sound is a medium of intense political and economic contestation whose battleground is the human body. So I want us to be able to draw always, even when we're talking about sound, we're on a continuum to affect. I mean, yes, but we're talking about sound. We're on a continuum to noise. We're on a continuum from sound. We're on a continuum to emotion. We're on a continuum to affect and the biopolitical. Sound is biopolitical. So, finally, and I'm sure I've left a lot out. I'm trying to tempted to just ask if there are Any questions? So now, finally, after 45 minutes, we're into the progressive era and the birth, if you will, of an affect of black popular culture. Studying this transition between noise and politics in the birth, if you will, of black, which I traced through the figure of Armstrong, or the Armstrong commodity. And I had planned here to kind of like give a little breakdown of progressive era reform movements, because that's one of the contributions I think that I'm hoping to make. Yeah, is that I feel like, you know, when you look at jazz studies and you look at really histories, you know, it's a large part of American popular culture. First of all, they go back to New Orleans consistently as a kind of generative site. But in doing so, they almost always trace themselves back to Storyville. And then there's a good reason, or these area of the 19 teens, and there's a good reason for that when you're talking about music in general, and certainly jazz. Because it's then that we begin to, the archives take a dramatic shift. Right? They become, you get, first of all, records, albums, and discs, and cylinders being produced and distributed. So we have a tangible evidence there. And there's a kind of rationality that's enacted already by the 1980s that makes a lot of sense to us in terms of its bureaucratic process and the administration of bodies. One thing I'm arguing is that we need to pull back farther and go back to this incredible social movement called the Progressive Era, which is not just capital P, capital E, but all the kinds of associated politics that are associated and cultural movements that produced the Progressive Era, marked by governmental reform, trust-busting, moral uplift, I'm going to move past that a little bit, and hopefully I want to find a way to kind of have an open discussion and talk about some of the things. So if you want to jump in at any time. So so rarely do we go back to what's happening in the 1890s and the 1910s, that first decade of the 20th century. Matter of fact, when I walked into the archives in the New Orleans Public Library, they were, you know, I expected to like do all of this kind of, I had a specific idea I was going to dig in, and they were like, finally, like you're here, like look at this, look at this, look at this. And so they pointed me directly to where they're going, because a lot of music researchers haven't gone into and made these links. Recently, a study on Buddy Bolden, an early, kind of very mystical figure in the evolution of black sound culture and jazz, who kind of went crazy in 1907, but was legendary in terms of the impact he had on any number of musicians during the first decade. A couple of studies have started to place him within the context of turn-of-the-century New Orleans. But what I'm arguing is that the discourse of noise and the policing of noise within civil society, within the courts, was firmly established, not just in New Orleans, but as an adjunct to progressive era reform movements. Sound was associated with everything from yellow fever to kidney disease to the moral degradation of the individual. And in discussions about sound, you bring it back to its most primitive and essential, was what were we doing to ourselves in the growing production of noise, right? Supreme effort is to make noise. If rowdyism and drunkenness and all the attendant evils are no longer in evidence on New Year's Day, the crowds on the street are greater than ever before, and the noise is louder, wilder, and more varied. The customers celebrating the day apparently dead among the grown-ups, the young people seem to have come to the front as the chief celebrants. Theirs is innocent celebration, holy. What is there wrong in parading down arm in arm up and down the streets, blowing horns, teasing all sorts of noises out of rattles, shooting off toy pistols, tickling one's neighbors with miniature feathers, dusters, constructions? Farther down, Noise, and yet more noise, seems to be the watchword of the modern New Orleans New Year celebrants. And from the time the chimes begin to peal on the stroke of 12 midnight until long into the following night, it is well nigh impossible to be quiet. Look, the reason I bring that up, and the kind of segue that I'm making here, so that's from 1905. The increase of volume of the noisy celebration of the day may be due in part to our consistently growing foreign population. So there's a discourse of noise that sees it as like kind of innocence, and there's an evidence trail that the cities are becoming louder. There are stories about New York, there are stories about cities, and there are comparisons in the Times-Picayune between the noise production of New Orleans and what's happening in European cities and other things. So there's a concern about noise. But embedded within this innocent discourse of noise, we start seeing intense forms of racism, right? And xenophobia associated with that. Who is an innocent producer of noise and who is a deviant producer of noise is embedded beginning in really around the turn of the century. One reason this is particularly important because there are two kind of governing mythologies of Armstrong. And I'm sorry for talking so fast, and I was afraid this might happen, squeezing out this stuff. And when you said that in the introduction, all of his sexy stuff on New Orleans, I said, oh God, I hope this doesn't get pressed down. It happens all the time. I can discipline myself. Look, one is the fact that he was born in New Orleans. Armstrong is born in New Orleans itself, is a part of one of Armstrong's governing mythologies. And so he's related to all kinds of narratives around New Orleans. The other kind of key turning point, which is a chapter in my book, is that in New Year's Eve, December 31st of 1912, Armstrong is arrested for shooting a pistol off on the streets, on Rampart Street. He's running around with a bunch of kids. He has his stepfather's gun. He shoots it off, and he becomes arrested and thrown into a reform school, a child penitentiary, essentially, where he becomes under strict, progressive era reform governance and manipulation. His bedtime hours are regulated, and it's in that kind of context of strict discipline and regulation, right? For the first time, arguably, in his entire life. He's a street urchin, essentially. He's one of these kids running around in what we call the street trades, right? More I could go into with that. But increasingly, his arrest, right, he places him right within the apparatus of Democratic Choctaw Club, New Orleans civil reform around race. And I've increasingly stopped using the term race so much for a couple of reasons. One, it's an amorphous kind of term that includes too much. Not too much, it depends what you're trying to say. I mean, it could be the right term if you're trying to say it. But, and ethnicity, I'm preferring to use the term black and blackness because it points to a specificity of a type of oppression that was enacted upon a particular formation and group of slave descendants and people with a particular phenotype. So I prefer the term blackness and anti-black. But here, the increase in volume of the noisy celebration of the day may be due in part to our constantly growing foreign population. Continental Europe has ever been partial to raising noisy men of his day. As a rule, it's holiday, and it goes on. It even talks about the Italians and others that are the immigrant groups that are rolling into New Orleans during that time. The nuisance of noise. Washington Post. The British government has decided to draft a bill to be submitted to the House of Commons. Gosh, I have the notes here and I put them down. There it is. The legislator says that a strong public opinion is forming against these barbarisms of useless, deafening, nerve-wracking noises. Public opinion in American cities is growing stronger in opposition to the unlimited use of the highways for purposes of torture. I mean, barbarism, torture. And these are associated with like forces of modernity and how modernity is going to be enacted. Absolutely. Blackness, anti-immigrant hysteria, and Cuba shows up a lot in these accounts in New Orleans. He was a Cuban vendor. He was Cuban. I think there's a really interesting discourse about Cubans. Protests against, it's really almost poetic, some of this stuff. As trifle becomes larger and more diversified in American life, it is inevitable that some nation will be taken. So anyway, you can see what's happening there, and I'm sorry I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to kind of flip through these. Religious Protestants planning religious law. And here we are in 1907. I'm going systematically, and I'm just taking samples out, right? Why, the reverend gentleman declared, last year I thought they would never stop their shouting. So, religious moral uplifts are going to the city council. And they're saying, we need to stop this, just like they did in 2014. It was based on citizen complaints. Someone didn't want to hear the sound who lived in the French Quarter. Right? So there's this tension going on. So it has religious overtones. Times became noisy New Year in New York, the most boisterous and ever witnessed in Gotham. Okay, now for me to go into some of these, I'm just going to have to, go off the top of my head and give me a couple of minutes. We're almost at 12.
Fine, you have till 1 o'clock.
I have to 1?
I said 2 hours.
Oh, this is great. Why didn't you give me a sec? Oh, this is fantastic. Okay, good. Let me take a drink of water. If you have any questions right now so far, let me organize my notes and get back to it because I put them down trying to rush through. So I'll be right with you. I'll be right with you.
I have a question if you want to take one now.
Yeah.
So I have a question about voice and sound. You used voice a lot at the beginning of your presentation. And I'm just thinking about how you're theorizing voice as the spoken word, voice as the sung word. And then also, I assume in the case of Armstrong that you're thinking of horn playing as part of voice as well. So I'm just trying to think, am I right about that, that the horn playing is part of the voice, and that do you theorize them all as the same or differently?
Repetition with a difference, I guess, is what we say. When we bring it down to the production of noise, right, then we're able to start, or I'm able to theoretically begin to make those kinds of distinctions, important distinctions, between what it means to speak, and of course, structuralism, post-structuralism have, gone on and on about, the relationship between the written and the spoken word, the logos, the power, what happens when something is written, what happens when something is spoken. So just looking at a voice, or what happens when one emits a scream or a cry, that's like an inarticulate kind of expression of vocalization. All of these need to be treated as having, right, their a certain a unique form of social organization. And it is, that question is precisely what made me go back and pick up a book that is now highly discredited. Jacques Attali, it's not discredited, I take that back, has become problematic, right? Jacques Attali's book, Noise and the Political Economy of Music, which just, at the time I read it as a grad student or whatever, or just out of grad school, whatever, really awoke me to noise studies, right? And the power, and Attali will argue that even the most innocuous, most innocent sounds, the dropping, have not just contained the apparatus of an entire history of power relations, capitalist, political, human, patriarchal, all kinds of different forces impose themselves on even the most seemingly innocent elaborations of noise. But he would also argue in this influential book that it's prophetic. In other words, you can also hear from that and read from that the future. Understanding the noise will teach you sound follows noise, he would argue. So therefore, understanding the noise of a culture will tell you where its sound culture is going, and in understanding its sound culture, you're going to be able to see where its political economy is going. So he chose this thing. Now, Attali became problematic, of course, because he, was an architect, first president of the European Bank for Reconstruction Development. He's was a friend of Mitterrand, I believe, and just like became an architect of neoliberal economic policies. So his book has been accused, and is accused, of being, and also there are questions about who he cites and where. So I've dealt with this by trying to deal with the specificity of the horn in an entire chapter, which actually is the chapter Tin Horn Blues, and that kind of, actually the production of sound. Armstrong doesn't become really known for his singing voice until the 30s almost, scat and some other forms, but the 1920s he's singing. No, he gets it in the 1920s. People are like railing, right, about, his style. It takes the industry as it's emerging by storm. So, in this section, Heebie-Jeebies, where I look about Armstrong's voice and scat singing, right now it should be like chapter 3, is where I kind of get into it, and I do address those differences, not to go on and on and on. But it's key, and it was actually a big problem I had for a while. It's like, oh, do I have to write all about Derrida just to like mention that, he's singing? So it took me a while reading through the materials to get, a grip on that question and where I stood within those kind of debates. Yeah, great. Anything else? We're into... So one section, I essentially deal with, in addition to newspaper reports, which I have more to say, but, maybe I'll go back to them in a minute. They're very important. Just looking through the various, not just the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans, the classical, but also looking through the black press, too. There were a couple of, keywords I was looking for. One was noise. I got to be like a noise magnet. Anywhere I saw the term noise, I could see it out of the corner of my eyes. You start scanning enough of these files, and you get that. So I'm looking for noise, but also I was looking for the relationship between the production of noise, to try to identify to differentiate where does noise become sound. If we're looking at this an emergency of a black sound culture, then clearly black communities are using their ability to voice, Philly sound to sound culture, music, black music just doesn't come from anywhere. It first comes from having a relationship to noise, having a relationship to the talking, having a relationship not just to noise, not just to talking, but a relationship to, what some might call the street, to public space, to shared space, to that the cartographies of power, if you will. An important thing to recognize about the first debate is the ways in which New Orleans is being segmented and saying, well, you're allowed to make noise here, you're not allowed to make noise there, this kind of, musical practice, sound practice, and we still do it in our ordinances, right? You're not allowed to, build certain type of things with your certain type of machinery in certain kinds of spaces. Noise is still a political thing. So I was really looking for noise, but in the ways in which it engaged civil society. And I kind of brushed past, too quickly past, some of my theoretical concerns that I am working from. Well, I went into the acts themselves, so that's a very major rubric that I'm deploying here, right? But also, I am saying it's not just an oral commodity, right? the Armstrong commodity. It's not just an aural one, a sound, that's A-U-R-A-L. It's an emotional commodity, right, which takes me into the realm of dealing with affect theory. I could say more about that. It's also a black commodity, right, or a racial commodity, a black commodity. Some would say racial. I'm also, as the title of the talk promised, dealing with a very crucial segue, a transition, right? Not a break. Very important to emphasize. A segue in a transition in the relationship between black bodies and black communities and civil society. There is a structure there of a civil structure that is going through an important shift. And one reason that I'm spending so much time on this time period is because one of my arguments with jazz studies is that, it's not really an argument, it's not like I blame them, but it's one of my observations and critiques, is that by not going back a little further than Storyville, right? Look, everyone will mention, it's like, the fact will be drawn like, Armstrong delivered coal, and in that job took him into dangerous neighborhoods and into the legendary red light district, where children of Armstrongs and black people were not allowed to go. They'll mention it, right? I'm saying you have to time out, because this isn't just a fact. It's not just a fact that he couldn't go there, which leads to a sentiment. You know, this is not a sentimental journey. This is a practical, mechanical act of social engineering that's taking place. And if you're going to understand social engineering, you have to understand the map. You can't just build a Brooklyn Bridge because it looks good and you can copy it on your sketch pad. You've got to know how much weight each of the cables can hold. That same care and attention needs to be placed on the fact of blackness and the fact of civil and social engineering. It's not enough just to say he couldn't go there. Essential. Should I go forward? Yeah, if I repeat it later than the thing, since I'm on a roll of sorts. Just go with it. People are quite happy to know. And Armstrong was born in 1901. One reason he has a reputation and is seen as a kind of founding, if you will, pops, a father figure, is because he is born in 1901. And of the folks that ended up making the transition into recording, he has an earlier, therefore, time one, which ostensibly roots him in a certain kind of authenticity to a certain time of existence of black being. Right? That others who were born even later can't necessarily, might be great, but Davis can't claim that kind of originary, you know, essence, core essence into the heart of New Orleans. So I've read many, almost all reports of Armstrong will say, mention Plessy Ferguson. You can find that, you know, either a paragraph if it's good, but usually it's 2 or 3 lines, because it takes that much even to mention something, you know. So, you know, Plessy versus Ferguson came down, blah, 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 blah. Look, what I argue is that Plessy versus Ferguson was nothing but a decree. You don't enact a policy by decree. People do what they want to do. You enact a decree which legitimizes the social engineering progress that you then go out and enact. I want to know what and how it's being enacted and what its implications are for our subjectivity, the subjectivity of the commodity that we help frame our identities around, whichever one we choose to identify with. You with me? So, Plessy versus Ferguson didn't just come out of the blue. Plessy versus Ferguson needed to be enacted on the ground, right? So, when you start looking through the court records, you see the real politics of, I don't know if you see the real politics, you start to being able to get a sense of or feel how contested lived life was on these streets of North America, let me just say. Because New Orleans truly is a Western Hemisphere city. It's another very fascinating thing that emerges. You realize when you get into so one thing that when I walked into the archives, not only were they, well, I'm going to show you something right off the bat. I think it's the next one. Yeah, it's this one. Now, I'm not going to go into the substances, but I want to say this is actually taken from an exhibit that the New Orleans Public Library, this isn't an archive that I took a picture of. Other ones, I took those photographs or made the copies of the PDFs. This actually comes from an exhibit hidden from history, which I find very interesting. So the New Orleans Public Library actually felt the need to have an exhibit, say, hey, look at these ordinances, people. These are hidden from history. These are behind the scene. When I walked in, they were like, I came in with the questions, but they were like, yeah, you know, here they are, bam, they're bringing the boxes. It was just like, so, I mean, I love that kind of stuff. I love, you know, that's, it's like, I could just sit there for, you know, the idea that someone touched this stuff and that they actually, back then, took a typewriter and wrote it, or that these are real signatures, just, I don't know, it turns me on, I don't know what to say. But, so, here are city ordinances. Okay, now I have about 6 things I want to tell you. I'm going to go back to here. So I've established more or less, I'm trying to show you that in the public discourse through these newspapers, noise was a discourse. There's a discourse of noise that is nuanced, it's racialized, it contains moral injunctions, it creates discussions about modernity, health issues around like advertisements. You know, doctors actually are having cures that are saying, you go into a quiet space, stay away from the street. Whatever you do, don't take, you know, your Southern Belle out into the streets where they can like hear things. You know, and it runs this discourse, and by the timeline, I wanted to take it back. I'm still holding on to Plessy Ferguson, by the way. I just want to establish some things, because I'm about to go back and deal with that. But right now, I want to just make sure, because I rushed through a little bit, you know, that this discourse is taking place, that it has a legacy, a continuity, time, and that it's filtering into Protestant talk, what is called, you know, anti-Semitism, you know, anti-Jewish, anti-Eastern European immigration, health conversations, so on and so forth. There's a whole nother conversation now going on that around civil society. Well, let me find this page. I'm with you. Don't worry. Right here. There you go. So in addition to newspaper reports, hold on to Plessy Ferguson 1 second, because I want to frame it. I'm going to go there, because this is a big critique of mine. So I'm going to pick that up in 1 second, but I don't want to lose a thought. Is this okay? Good. In addition to newspaper reports from the black and white press, I examined primarily about 5 different bodies of archival material. One was the City of New Orleans Archives Department itself, which had like ordinances, licenses, fees, and a whole number of different just bureaucratic paperwork that they hold and went through. 2, the City of New Orleans Board of Commissioners of Prisons and Asylums annual reports, which I'm not going to go through here, but which are utterly fascinating. These asylum and prisoners, the fact that they're put together, and they, at this early era, through this period, time period, kept very careful records of how many were whites, how many were blacks, how many were white women, how many were black women, right? And how many were juveniles. The juvenile and the child is a real, which is relevant, of course, because Armstrong is a child during these years, so he becomes under the administrative apparatus of the child. And in New Orleans during this time, let me say, New Orleans is important to progressive era politics because it was in New Orleans where a very particular type of democratic populism and progressivism was instituted, right? And the rhetorics of what ultimately, I'm saying there's a direct lineage between the democratic, progressive revolution, I almost say, in New Orleans politics that happens in the 1890s. Typically 1890 is seen, if you read college textbooks, 1890 is like the birth of the progressive era, and then, I don't know the exact end of the year, but somewhere in 1917, I guess around World War I would be the end of it, of this period. But New Orleans was absolutely crucial because what it did was, through this space, and why we even talk so much about Plessy Ferguson, is because Plessy Ferguson, for those, I'm assuming maybe that people know what Plessy Ferguson is, through, and there's no mistake that Plessy versus Ferguson was an act that reached the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., right? But had its origins on the streets of New Orleans itself. Homer Plessy challenging a man who was like, what, 7/8 white, actually, through political organization. And I would draw a legacy between those musicians who went into the city council chamber. If you look at that, it was a very diverse kind of crowd of musicians who were going in there trying to enact and challenge the regulatory mechanisms of the city council in 214. A very similar kind of alliance went into constructing the Plessy Ferguson case. Its roots actually go back to 1892. It took until, what, 1896, right, for it to reach 4 or 5 years. But you can't go to that final verdict that everyone does. You have to understand Plessy Ferguson in the 5 or 6 years that led up to it. And if Homer Plessy brought the case, which was a highly constructed case, like most civil rights Supreme Court amendment challenges are. These aren't spontaneous Rosa Parks walking onto it. They planned it. Brown versus Board of Ed was planned, right? So was Plessy Ferguson. So if he did it, that act in 1892, the tensions are building from the 1880s onwards. But there was a reason I'm arguing that it took place in New Orleans, because it was this incubator. It was this petri dish, and it was also on the forefront of engineering the post-slave world. What I say in my call, the transition from either post-emancipation or the post-downfall of Reconstruction, the post-slave America, and the relationship between the slave economies, the plantation economy and industrial society, and the legal, judicial apparatus, legislative apparatus that could be sanctioned in Washington. New Orleans and their Choctaw Club and Mayor Shakespeare, followed by Mayor Behrman, right? These are Democratic Party machinery politicians who impose their will on the city intensely, right? He had like 20 years of power there. Became the model for the country, which is another reason we might be able to argue that Armstrong became or was able to articulate his subjectivity both, not only to the streets of New Orleans, but beyond, because very much so. So, here we go. Plessy versus Ferguson doesn't come out of anywhere. And a lot of these ordinance and amendments become very important. So I mentioned all of that. I'm going back to Plessy Ferguson. See what happens when you go from the script, you stray from the script. That City of New Orleans Board of Commissions of Prisoners and Asylums annual reports from 1910 to 1910, which I read because Armstrong's arrested on New Year's Eve of 1912, December 31st, January 1st of 1913, right? He's 11 years old. So he enters this apparatus. I'm not going into that in this talk, but that was a lot of stuff. And what it really reveals, just to kind of summarize, what it really shows us, what it demonstrates, is the relationship between, it went just like this. You have the relationship between the mayor, and letters from between mayor and this agent called Thomas Agnew. And he was in charge of the prevention of cruelty to children, but he was essentially a watchdog. I mean, this was he'd go out onto the streets and he'd find any store that had a pornographic postcard or where children were standing too close to a bar. I mean, these were aggressive. He wasn't just the agent, these were aggressive attempts to police the behavior of New Orleans citizens and residents along gender and racial and ethnic and immigrant lines, right? So this was very progressive. So it went from the Mayor Behrman to Thomas Agnew to his #1 representative or liaison. Agnew's #1 liaison to the black community is this guy Joseph Jones. Joseph Jones and Thomas Agnew are like this, and they show up. Joseph Jones's name shows up. He's a black man, and he's in charge of the New Orleans children. And Joseph Jones's name shows up in biographies of Louis Armstrong regularly. Especially the ones that go more in depth, because it was Joseph Jones who was in charge of the colored wave song, who then put in his job to hire all of the people who made sure that the colored wave song was being run like a military institution that used corporeal punishment, right, and imposed strict regimentation. And Armstrong says himself that his style can be traced back to his years at the colored wave song. Armstrong says this. If you want to understand my stuff, you have to go back and understand my time at the colored wave song. Colored wave song, Joseph, Thomas Agnew, and the mayor of New York. And you look through these, and there it is, bam, bam, bam. I wish we had time to go into all of that. The other archive is the New Orleans Police Department of Inspector of Police Correspondence. And this is what this is right here, the City of New Orleans. And there's just all of these kind of a catalog. Any questions right now? Any thoughts? So that's what I'm reading right now. The New Orleans Police Department Officer of Inspector of Police Correspondence. This is where they're talking about. Let me go to here. Oh, let's go forward. This is an application for a free, these are permit applications. And during these years, it's really interesting to watch how the focus of the police units shift after and around 1899 and 1900. This is a couple of years after Plessy Ferguson. You start to really see what it meant, the implementation of segregation and how it meant. There's a real, the focus of the police units after 1900, around the time of the election, first election of Mayor Behrman, around 1904, it escalates. So you can see this kind of steady shift in emphasis. You see a lot, early on, you see a lot of widows with dependent children. They're doing things like selling sandwiches, lunches, and cakes, and they're granted free licenses, exceptions, because you couldn't really sell food unless you had a hardship, let's say. And in order to get like a hardship allowance, you had to go and get an application to conduct free market capitalism on your own, whatever it may be, selling coal, selling wood, selling sandwiches, so on and so forth. I don't know, but I've thought about the fact that it may be kind of similar to some of the measured political economic reforms in Cuba as they are slowly starting to grant licenses, but very carefully, to independent investors to do things like sell sandwiches out of their windows and so forth. So these are not unheard of reforms. I note that the inspectors are reluctant to give free permits, really, to able-bodied, quote-unquote, men. The general criteria for receiving free permits is poverty, judged in relation to the inventory of less than $10 of the goods being sold. Dependent children, if people have dependent children, then they have it. This is, mind you, pre-around 1900 what's happening. During the 1890s, these are the criteria that are being imposed. So a lot of the records from 1897, 1898, 1899, and 1900. Absence of working age men. If someone has a wagon, it's often seen as a sign of wealth. But they're also taking into account complaints during this time. You see it in the thing. Complaints about public behavior. So you could be fit the criteria, but you know, if there are complaints about public drunkenness, disorderliness, or what is called generally disturbing the peace, then you are deemed ineligible, right, to receive this fee permit. So the permits to transact trade were being granted based on behavioral criteria. Noise being one of these, one's social presence within the streets of New York being one of the, New Orleans being one of the criteria by which one could have, let me see if I go here. Yeah, good. So here's an example of one of these reports. I believe this is the right one, but I'll read you a couple to give you an idea. Mrs. Emma Morgan is a colored woman having a husband and 4 children living. She conducts a small wood and coal shop at above address, stocks about $6. She states that her husband left here about 2 months ago to work at New Iberia, Louisiana, but has so far failed to send her any money, and further states that she never asked for a free permit, but if given one, would help her considerably. Another report from the same time period, 1898. Mr. Lehman was selling sandwiches of all kinds, pies, cakes, and milks in bottles from a stand under shed number 8. Janine Street, near the fruit landing. He also had 4 or 5 boys going around selling from baskets, eatables, and all were doing business under the one permit. Mr. Lehman is doing at least from $40 to $50 of business a day, which is in direct violation of his permit. The permit requiring that the stock should not exceed $10. Respectable Richard T. Walsh. Another report. Sir, Corporal Joss Shea reports having investigated as to whether Mrs. Augustine Pierce, residing at 1858 Burgundy Street, was entitled to a free permit from His Honor the Mayor, and submits the following. The lady is a widow with 6 children and desires to sell lunches, sandwiches, cakes by peddling the same in the basket, respectfully. But by 1901, so these are general kind of broad criteria that we kind of are getting, where we're really seeing economic criteria. By 1901, you see a distinct shift in these permits and in the police correspondence that go with them. You start seeing things, here's one from 1901. Officers of Buckley and Hovell reports relative to the application of Miss Adele Lewis of number 1909 Lafayette Street for a dance in private residence. The officer does not know anything about the house, but the neighborhood is a very bad one, infested with Negroes. You see, like these kind of, I mean, like really, you know, they're being compared to vermin, to Negroes. So at some point, you know, they stop making these kind of recommendations. One reason I go into such detail, you can see these are narratives. right? There's a whole discourse. They're writing. They're like, you see, they're telling a story. They're creating a whole story, and they're creating not just a narrative, but they're establishing a what's the word? That is, it's not a big fancy word. It's just because I'm standing in front of people. This is a problem going. But you see what I'm saying? They're creating the character and the criteria of suffering, a grammar and a structure of citizen, a grammar and a structure of worthy suffering and unworthy suffering, right? Of worthy citizenship and unworthy citizen. To go back to the musical example of worthy deviance, right? And unworthy deviance, if you will. So at some point, they stop making as many recommendations and simply give the details of the circumstances. It looks like this is true only when there is some ambiguity. Around the turn of the century, there are new reports having to do with police surveillance. Increasingly, you see police surveillance in these reports. 1899, I found 3 that specifically have to start doing with immoral residencies. And the whole idea of disturbing the peace and immoral residencies, increasingly concerned with the character of the particular residences, in addition to not so much just their circumstances. There's a difference between a circumstance. I'm poor, I can't make money, my husband left. But she's a good woman, right? She lives across the street, all her neighbors attest to, oh, this is a house of, a devious Negro, so forth and so on. So after 1901, the files really stopped collecting inspectors' reports on licenses. You'll notice the last one that I read weren't necessarily based on licenses. They start dealing with citizen complaints. And a large proportion of these have to do with sound, noise, civil disturbances within a given block, geography, or cartography. There's a large gap until 1909. They have more focus upon that, on violations of something that is called the Gay-Shattuck Law, or the Gay-Shattuck Act. Now, when I went in to talk to the archive and librarians, they were like, you need to study this law. You need to, pay attention. What you're looking for is the Gay-Shattuck Act of 1908. The Gay-Shattuck Act, or law, essentially was an early form of, if you want to say, prohibition, right? So alcohol was where and how alcohol and what conditions alcohol could be served became a key focus of this real conservative enactment. And it had a profound impact on the spatial politics of New Orleans. Far more so than the mere statement of, really, when you get down to the law and the act, what the policemen are really enacting is not Plessy Ferguson. They're enacting hundreds of city council ordinances and laws, some of which are quite minor and have to do with maybe, can you wear shoes here or there? But a lot of them end up having deep consequence. This is what allows, these acts and these ordinances are what allow the surveillance of the New Orleans community and the policing of racial and ethnic boundaries within the city. So the Gay-Shattuck Law of 1908 specified that music could not be played, right, in an establishment in proximity or within an establishment selling alcohol. So that was its kind of big thing. So it had a devastating impact on, the Jelly Roll Mortons, the guy, that whole classic era, like kind of Scott Joplin, and where you had a piano player going, and there's a bar in the background, and you can walk up like in the old westerns to the second floor, and someone was, is that a pistol in your pocket? So, but it had so it was an early prohibition act. but it had other clauses attached to it that were specifically towards. So it went farther than that. It wasn't just saying that you could not have music in an establishment that was selling alcohol, right? It also went to say, like, you know, women in an establishment where women were present. Music or alcohol, you know, what is the relationship between music, sound production, right? So I've kind of started with thinking about noise in the 1890s and what's happening there. And then you start seeing it evolving from like discourses of noise are being implemented as a conversation and a policy and a policing surveillance of now we're getting into sound, music, you know? They're kind of like honing in their apparatus of ordinances and police codes. And you see it even, I'm trying to say now, in these kind of things, which began talking about hardship claims, but end up being a tool of the police chief and the police department to police buildings, police residences, police neighborhood blocks, and police districts, and ultimately the entire city. I'm straying from notes, but am I making sense? Any questions? Are you with me? So the Gay-Shattuck Act, and they were begging me to like look into this Gay-Shattuck Act. Very few histories that I've read of jazz go too deeply into Gay-Shattuck, right? In 1908 as this crucial point. So it's very clear that the passage of the act or law, okay, so let me finish. So you have music, alcohol, women, and black bodies. There's almost like 4 things that this law ends up enacting itself. It says certain things, but when you watch what the police are doing and what the reports say, they'll be like, there was a black guy sitting at a table, and there were 2 white women in there, and I don't know exactly what they were doing in there, but we found music in there, and we broke the whole thing up. So they're using Gay-Shattuck as a means to police any number of kind of mobs, the intersection of noise, sexuality, and so on and so forth. Very clear that after the passage of the act or law, there was an increased emphasis placed upon surveillance of immorality. There are stakeout logs and recommendations to keep careful watch on particular buildings and establishment with what appears to be a particular focus on colored and or Negro establishment, at least in the surviving records. Another trend I see is for citizen informants to write letters to the police with specific complaints. So when we're talking about the transition, right, into a post-slave society, from a slave democracy into a carceral democracy, this habit under the slave system of having deputized, right, slave patrollers who were able to literally carry a gun and were responsible, you know, if you were white, you were basically, you deputized. White citizens were basically deputized to surveil and patrol plantation plantation cultures, plantation economy. You can see that transition from the deputized white citizen into the police informant white citizen. So you have all kinds of crazy letters, and I don't know what's next, but I want to have one. That's not the one I'm looking for. Well, that one's interesting. Let me go there. I think I've already talked over this one. But you get where I'm going with this, right? From a post-slave, from a slave society into a post-slave society. And in between that, we have the progressive era, like reform movement, and the political machinery, particularly in the city of New Orleans, serving as the model, I argue, for not just 20th century Democratic Party politics and alliance, right, a Democratic Party structure that famously starts fracturing in '64 with Goldwater, you know, and the Southern strategy of Nixon that lead us into what is arguably now our post neoliberal, let me say that, contemporary capitalist moment that starts happening in globalization in the 1970s and stuff corresponds. You with me? Corresponds with the kind of fracturing of that. That's a whole other conversation, probably. Right now I'm projecting as the conclusion of my study. Hello, Dolly. 64. But also, this is it, I am arguing it becomes the model for American liberalism. I'm not just talking about that right-wing trend of the Democratic Party, because all of these apparatuses are still functional within the American Party, the American political system and civil society, really wherever I've been able to look in turn. These kind of rules, these modes, this apparatus of civil policing has become almost the norm. And you can, expand today. Why are there so many black bodies in prison? Why doesn't George Zimmerman get, why does Michael get convicted? Why does Michael Brown's body lie in the street for 4 hours in a perverse replay of the lynched black body that would hang in the streets, at the city, town gates for sometimes days, but certainly for hours. The continuities of these kind of transition from the slave democracy to the carceral democracy and these communities. You can see this transition happening there. And it's very interesting to me how it plays out. It doesn't only happen in noise culture, but I just happen to be interested in noise culture around the project on noise culture, so that's my interest. What about the sound commodity? And how is it shaped and framed by these larger social forces, democratic forces, if you will, in the United political forces, emotional forces? So let me see if I'm missing anything here. So there's a large gap until 99, stakeout laws. Another trend, citizen informants writing letters to the police with specific complaints. We can see a marked shift in the administrative focus of the New Orleans Police Department after the passage of Gay-Shattuck. The emphasis of the paperwork moves from vendor licensing permits to violations of liquor laws that are also a shield for other things. So where are we now? New Year's fire noise. I guess I went past that. Talked about that. I don't want to bounce around too much. We'll talk about that. Okay. Well, I think we're doing pretty okay here. I'm going to stop and ask and just go through some of these. Inspector report, January 25th. So now notice the date, 1910. Goes into a detail about a barroom conflict and the alleged violation of the Gay-Shattuck Act. It only mentions that it's a colored barroom. So you got to read in code in a lot of these things. You know what I mean? You can kind of start telling when a Jewish person is being talked about. You can start telling when a black person, and you can almost always start telling when a white person is being talked about because they don't say anything. They just say a person, a human. It's a colored barroom at South Rampart. This is right near Louis Armstrong's home. The assault takes place at 2:00 a.m. Never mentions race of the 2 women. The 4 white men were eating oysters or drinking beer and whiskey with. And I wish I had my pin map here on my thing. I just figured I wouldn't have time for it. But what I've done is I've taken New Orleans, right? And for each of these kind of instances, I've given different colored pins. So like I have where he lived, with his grandmother till he was about 5. I have where he moved into the heart of what's called, the battleground, right? Which was in the Black Storyville. Is this going to mess me up too much, you think?
What are you going to do?
I wanted to get this up. And New Orleans map story. Here, this one. I've seen that one before. Oh, you can't see it.
You're gonna have to exit out of the.
Anyway, you have the bend in the river, and you have the French Quarter. I don't know if any of you can see whether you have the French Quarter, the famous where Mardi Gras goes. On the tail end of that, right, you have this district, Storyville, you know, which was the red light district, famous red. Again, a step. Great. So there's Storyville, right? Blacks aren't really allowed that much in Storyville, not popular, contrary to popular belief. This is known as the Black Storyville right here. Armstrong moves from around here with his grandmother at 5 years old, Josephine, who is actually his father's mother. There's a lot of disparaging of Willie Armstrong in biographies of Louis Armstrong biographies. But it was actually his paternal grandmother that he lived with around here. Around 5 years old, he and his sister moved down for really not entirely clear reasons to right around here, right on the edge of Storyville, which is, you know, you might as well be, you know, in Black Storyville. Very poor. So there's just a lot of speculation that Armstrong's mother was a prostitute. You know, various different things. Armstrong has a habit of saying contradictory things and leaving things that are wink, wink, nod, nod, so you have to read into. But it seems pretty clear that she was in one way or another associated with the red light district of what's happening. So we're talking about, you know, a bar that's like here, right? Like we're talking about like 2 blocks away. And he tells tons of stories of going down into all the spaces, the legendary spaces for music and bars within Black. So he spent a lot of time. He was a street urchin in Black Storyville by the time he was like five years old, which is crazy. That's like a nomad's age. You think, you know, he was just bored. At 5 years old, he'd be just like, get out of here, nomad, get out of the house. And he's running around with other kids at that age, being really taken care of by slightly older kids. Yeah, let's get back to the good. Now I've tried to include some of those really sexy cases. All right, well, I'm going to keep going off the top of my head. So you can see, you know, all kinds of stuff is happening right around Armstrong's house where he lives. Now, good. Yes. This is a letter to the official inspector around 1910. Again, what I'm thinking about here is the ways public space is being adjudicated, the way it's being negotiated at the time when he's like 9 years old. He's going to end up being arrested when he's 11 years old. What I think is interesting about this, right, is Honorable Martin Behrman, Mayor, City, dear sir, I enclose you here with a copy of a letter addressed to the President of the New Orleans Railway and Light Company, writing the President, from Attorney and Counsel of Law, Mr. A.D. Preston. Address, relative to Negro newsboys jumping onto the cars, especially on the St. Charles Avenue line, rushing through them, which he claims is not only an annoyance to the passengers, but is in violation of the provisions of Act 64 of 1902. So this is what I'm trying to draw our attention to. They're talking to a very particular provision they're still debating from 8 years earlier as a mean of policing black children, black boy bodies. And these are the topper level. This is the mayor and the administration solving a civil concern about what little kids like Armstrong are doing. So it's not just that some cop, the way it's often told, some cop rolls up on Armstrong because he stole his father's pistol and just shot it off into the night. This is going on. People are shooting off pistols all over the place in New Orleans on New Year's Eve. It's not just something some deviant boy did, right? Kids are running all over the city. He was a part of what they call the street trades. He was a part of a class of workers, of children, not just in the city of New Orleans, but all over New Orleans, Louisiana, and the South in the United States. Cities had kids who were selling newspapers, shining shoes, singing for money on the streets, dumpster diving for stuff to bring back, begging, hustling. He was one of probably, several thousand kids, that's a guess. But he was one of certainly hundreds, right? Gangs, groups of kids who were under the focus and the attention. So before he even emerges as a subject to utter a word, he's encountering an apparatus of surveillance and police authority. Not as a broad statement as it's always talked about, like I've said, Plessy versus Ferguson from, 14 years earlier. No. By the systematic, democratic process implemented imposition of ordinances and codes that were being enacted, and the licensing of surveillance and policing of black bodies and voices. So that's one thing I wanted to, emphasize with that slide. Yeah, here's another one, 1911, again, a year before. Report relative to investigation of complaint about profane language and noise around New Orleans Public Library situated, on Magazine Street. Very concerned, and I'm hoping that I put, well, there's just one fascinating, which I just figured rightfully so that I wouldn't have time to go into, about the behavior of kids playing. There, people are very concerned. Hey, kids are playing baseball in the lot, and they are using profane, disturbing language. They're creating a disturbance in our neighborhood. And the agents and the police will go down there and break up the game and engage the kids on their behavior, and it becomes a moral issue, but more than that, it becomes a police issue. And I thought it was very interesting in the 2014 incident about the noise ordinances in New Orleans that one of the things the protesters were demanding is to how to switch jurisdiction from the police department to the health department. This isn't a century-old thing, 2014 to the turn of the century. What becomes a health issue, yellow fever, noise, noise is placed in the category of litter and all kinds of essentially sanitary discourses around sanitary become, in that case, a police issue. It's not just, here's a ticket for leaving, your litter out. It's like you're going to jail. You're under surveillance, and we're doing it because of the noise you're making. And that's the shelter we're losing. 2014, I don't even know if the protesters realize what a deep shift that would be to at least get it back into the health and not under the police distribution. Whether noise can do that today in New Orleans, maybe we'll have to go down there and hang out to find out. So, yeah, that's one thing. Now, this is just one of the incredible ones, and there were like two that I'm not going to be able to go into, but I wish I could sit here and read some of these transcripts because they are unbelievable. A couple of them are unbelievable. One, it just fell too far outside of the scope of the timeline I'm dealing with. So there's this woman, Fatima, from 17 or 18, a black woman, who is sent into court. And she's being accused of prostitution. But what they start doing is keeping elaborate court transcripts of the dialogue that's taking place. And they even include, you know, the languages that they spoke. I mean, you know, dialect of. So this guy, boisterous outcry, becomes this major. So anyway, let me finish with Fatima. She goes over and she finally stands up in court and goes like, "You're effing harassing me! I can't step out of my door when you're standing across the street. You've arrested me like 5 times and I'm walking to the court." It just mirrors today's discourses about, you know, search and frisk, stop and frisk. And she's sitting like, what? No one has still told me what I'm in violation of. If I'm selling, you know, my body, then, you know, show me the evidence. I'm going to the store. Leave me alone. You know, it's like, and you can see that. But that's 1970. So here you have these elaborate cases of boisterous outcry, and this is just one of them, right? Testimony for the defendant. Now, on the day that you were arrested, what were you doing? I was sitting in the wagon with 2 little fellows. Do you know what street? It was that you first saw the officer on Cypress near Johnson, near the corner. Were you hollowing out your wares at the time? No, sir. Was anything said to you by the police officer? Policemen just tell me, "What are you doing around here?" And I said, "Nothing. A woman want to buy a basket of grapes." And he stopped me. And he said, "Get off this heat and go on about your street and go on about your business." When I was going off, 2 or 3 blocks away from him, he go get his horse and he say, "Stop," until the other policeman come. He told me to stop. That was all that was done? Yes, sir. You say you didn't holler? You didn't yell? No, sir. You were not hollering out your wares? No, sir. I wasn't hollering at all. Alphonse Cruz being called to the witness stand. What's your name? Alphonse Cruz. How old are you? 15. Can you read and write? A little bit. What do you mean by that? I know a little bit. Can you read the morning paper? Some of it. What do you mean by you can read some of it? I can read a little of it. Do you know the nature of an oath? No, sir. How many years did you go to school? About 2 years. What school did you go to? I used to go to St. Mary's School. What do I mean you used to go to St. Mary's School? On Ursuline, between Decatur and Sharp. What grade were you in? On and on and on, right? No, so he's trying to test his eligibility to take an oath. But you can see the ability, literacy, one's ability to read and write. Who's saying that that's not being a part of the adjudication of that case, right? Who's to testify on what noise is deviant and what is acceptable? What is a standard deviation, right, from an ambient norm? Who gets to decide the standard deviation? All of these are questions that come up. I hope I didn't get. I got into enough of the cool stuff. There's boisterous outcry. There was another just incredible one that I decided not to use, but called obscene acts with the mouth, and it's similar. Has a transcript, and it's such a case of policing of queer bodies. Right? The police, and there are 2 different reports. In one report, they have the arrest of this 17-year-old kid. And what's the charge? Obscene acts with the mouth. And it's described, we busted this guy performing, these 2 people performing oral sex behind a box of carts, performing obscene acts with the mouth. Right? But then, about 2 weeks later, they go back into court, and the records are right there. And instead, it's just so obvious they've gotten this guy to testify against the other queer male, you know? Because he's turned around, then he goes like, well, you know, I talked to the cop there, he told me to go run off over there, and then I came back and I went right to the police and I told them about him, and I was just waiting for him to interrupt. And did he say, and they go into extreme detail of what, you know, was happening, you know, with the body. Now, between the 2 males. That's the end of the talk. thank you. I'm sorry, and I hope I didn't stray too far off of course at different junctures, but I hope there's a certain kind of coherence that comes together behind the project and that you're able to put it into perspective. And I don't know if we have time for a question or two, or there might be...
Well, I guess we have time to figure this out.
Yeah. Yeah. So I didn't include the obscene acts with the mouth. I was thinking of it. There's one thing I was doing this morning, trying to think if there was some way I could show several other really fascinating incidents of policing, you know, this transition between affect, emotion, noise, and sound. But I didn't get into the sexual politics as deeply as the topic warrants. Is this here for me?
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Fancy stuff.
Yeah.
Could you say, I think you made a really good case for tracing the importance of this kind of trajectory, which is really important, I would think, in laying the groundwork. I'm wondering, could you tell us about the subsequent chapters where you go from here in the book process?
Yeah. Well, I just had one piece come out that really talks about, and you know, and one thing that I really need and like about the writing process is because it demands that coming into it. And when people ask me questions like this around my pop, and sometimes I give them a different answer. And I go like, well, what's your project? It's about emotional labor. What's your project about? It's about sound culture. And earlier than I can come up with different things. But like the practice, the chapter structure or the thematic structure is his rooted childhood in New Orleans in the street, right? So introduction, first chapter, kind of deals with early Louis Armstrong. And what I'm really paying attention to are the ways he talks about his encounters with the sound, with singing, right? And the horn during these early years of his life, right? So there's a chapter on those encounters, and that's the one that just came out in Music and Politics. Then I have another section on the wave song, the prison industrial nexus. Well, it's not industrial at that time, I guess, but the prison carceral nexus that helps frame his sound. And in that section, I'm also considering how does that incarceration impact rhythm, note, melody, tone. Because all of those things are embedded in the way he talks about learning his horn. He talks about waking up in the morning and being the one in charge of waking up every morning and singing taps to get all the kids up, and how proud he felt when he would go out with his horn and go, so he's using the horn to regiment society. Can we read any of that in the subsequent Armstrong commodity as it emerges later? We think of the jazz commodity as freedom. It's freedom personified. This is democracy personified, and I'm really arguing against that. You know, this is not a celebratory account. It's a sober account. I'm trying not to make it a sentimental account. It's a mechanical account to some extent, you know? And so how does tone get framed to regiment authority? I won't be the first to talk about, you know, sonic warfare and other things, but often in those accounts, right, there's a difference between the way Adorno will Lockenrug, Schopenhauer, you know, the way that, you know, we talk about music in a classical sense, and the way we talk about black music, as if these are like different species, right, of cultural production. And I'm saying, no, this is the regimentation of democracy. Jazz is not the epitomization of democratic practice. It is a desperate attempt, right, to escape domination authority, you know, and if you want to call that, like, you know, positive, then sure, but let's not sentimentalize. Another chapter, we're talking about his encounter into mainstream, what we would call pop music, Chicago, right? The OK Record section, the Hot Fives, and in particular the role of technological rationality and technological anxieties in 1920s. There's this mythological, there is a mythologized narrative about Armstrong's early encounter with the recording studio, right? He goes in there and he invents scat scenes, something we know is not true.
Yeah.
Scat scenes, but for years people thought that Armstrong invented scat because he went into the studio, he was just blowing his mind out, he was so concentrated, and the sheet music fell on the ground. He forgot the lyrics and he started making up words, and thus we have scat. And I'm saying no. Here we have a young boy who's lived under surveillance his whole life, encountering the most modern forms of technological apparatus. White managers coming in, Joe Glazer, things are happening, and the heebie-jeebies, which is his first major hit, right? Where he goes, I got the heebies, the heebie-jeebies, he's talking about the heebie-jeebie-doo, the heebie-jeebie-doo, right? And I said, this is a response. I'm reading it, you know what it is, but I read it as an anxious response to domination, surveillance, and an encounter with the scientific, technological rationality of the modern commercial recording popular music infrastructure, which he negotiated with a smile, with an affect, and we can read all kinds of anxiety, I argue. Then there's, you know, two other kind of periods. One having, do you know what it means to miss New Orleans, in which I, you know, consider, you know, this Decca period. There's a whole lot of arguments around Armstrong. What is his best music? Did his music die in the night when he started becoming a pop icon? Many people say his best music was in the 1920s. He was organic and doing classical New Orleans jazz, Dixieland stuff, you know. But, and others say that's all garbage, and then others say like, no, you're missing the point, man. This is like his coolest stuff, you know, in the 1950s. So I try to place it within the politics of, and this isn't fully written or anything yet. I mean, I have sketches, and I've done some writing on it, but with the institution, Katrina.
Yeah.
You know, the apparatus of Katrina, and do you know what it means to emote, to affect, to miss New Orleans, is the governing question of that. So, and where have we gone? So I'm already starting to tie up some of the problematics that I lay out there. And then there's a projected section. It's very interesting. These later Armstrong, which is really the modern Armstrong that we kind of inherit and know, and that is popularized and known, the Louis Armstrong House and Archives in Queens, was really a construction, right, of a school, of a form of jazz criticism that Wynton Marsalis and his relationship with Albert Murray, and his relationship, and that relationship with Stanley Crouch, and that relationship with the writer Ralph Ellison. And there's a whole lot of debates about their politics. They have a kind of a classical jazz ethic where they you know, they really want to go back to New Orleans, that modern jazz, free jazz is lost, that we need to get back to not just the style of the jazz masters in the green. It's not just Armstrong, but they would take you to Duke, Ellington, and others, or Count. You know, they like really worship this music from the 20s and 30s, you know, and really are critical of like Parker's drug, you know, addled, and what they would call. So, we start looking at the institutionality of contemporary jazz and jazz studies. And these were the very cats who were called upon to create and to facilitate the canonization of jazz as a classical musical idiom, which I'm very critical of. And they didn't just do it intellectually; they just didn't do it with, you know, Wynton Marsalis, you know, doing these. Some of them quite beautiful. I'm not saying it's all like crap, you know, but like these suites, very classical kind of jazz suites, you know. I'm just critiquing and coming at it from a critical position, you know what I mean? I would hate to be subject to the kind of theoretical scrutiny I'm subjecting some of these people was fair. But they also had an incredible amount of institutional funding and apparatus, and they were instrumental. Marsalis gets his paycheck now from the Lincoln Center Jazz Center. And you know, that place is situated right on the old ethnic neighborhood there, that west side story. That was like all, Puerto Rican, lower kind of expression of Spanish, New York, where a lot of those rhythms came directly and were right underneath the the subterranean structure of what Lincoln Center Jazz, the whole politics of that real estate, the whole politics of that, and where that money went. And Stanley Crouch has made crazy money on that. And Ralph Ellison has some problematic politics.
Wow, what a great book. I think it really hangs together too, in terms of your commitments all the way through.
Well, I hope you're right. I really do. But it's been great to get back to it because one thing about tenure track process, you got certain demands and things you just have to do.
Yeah.
And I actually am coming back to the project. I'll be honest, it's kind of built on my dissertation. After a while, I was like, I don't want to hear anything about it. And then after a couple of years, links would happen, and I was like, no, now I love this thing.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing way new inspirations. Because you do learn a lot, teaching and stuff too. I'm sorry, it's like, it's labor, but, ideas brew and simmer, so I'm excited. And I can't thank you enough.
You deserve it, Dalton.
Swear to goodness.
You deserve it, absolutely. So,
thank you for coming out. Really somebody will want to listen to you. That's still surprised me.
Great stuff.